witchcraft wasn't exactly a new phenomenon. The witch hunts during the 17th and 18th century in Europe were marked by the amount of deaths that occurred during that time period. Over 100,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe alone. Many historians have come to the conclusion that these accusations stemmed from social and political agendas rather than any actual fear of witchcraft. Most of the accused witches were tortured until they confessed their crimes, which were often various renditions of infamous witch stereotypes, such as dancing around the campfire in the middle of the night while listening to AC/DC. Honestly, it's a little hard to stay innocent when you've been thunderstruck and hell's bells shook you all night long. Now, women were the primary targets of these witch hunts, especially the old and decrepit, because, grandmothers are really scary. Now, life seems to like a little irony in the way it does things. Women were targeted primarily because of their insatiable lust, even though historically men have been more prone to sexually aggressive behavior. In the 17th century, the witch hunts began to lose their luster. By the 18th century, governments had begun to stabilize and people began questioning old attitudes about religion. Now, the 30 Years' War is split up into 4 phases: the Bohemian phase, the Danish phase, the Swedish phase, and the Franco-Swedish phase. It all started in the territory of the Bohemian Estates. Now, the people there wanted someone to rule over them, so they got this guy named Archduke Ferdinand. Archduke Ferdinand was a Catholic, whereas the people of the Bohemian Estates were primarily Calvinist. So they didn't exactly mesh together very well, especially after Ferdinand wanted to re-Catholicize all of Bohemia. So they got rid of him and they replaced him with this guy named Elector Frederick V of Saxony.
Ferdinand did not like this very much, and he attacked the Bohemian nobles with the help of Maximilian of Bavaria, as well as the Catholic League in the Battle of White Mountain outside Prague on November 8, 1620. The Spanish couldn't wait to get in on the action and invaded the Palatinate during Frederick's predicament. They conquered it by 1622. The Spanish took control of the western part of the Palatinate, and Duke Maximilian of Bavaria took control of the rest of the territory. Ferdinand was re-established as the King of Bohemia, so I guess happy ending there for those guys. The second phase of the war began when King Christian IV of Denmark intervened on the behalf of the Protestant cause. He had made an anti-Habsburg and anti-Catholic alliance with the United Provinces in England. Despite the significant size of Christian's army, his forces fell against Count Tilly's Catholic League, and later against Albrecht von Wallenstein. After all of his successes, Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution in March 1629. The edict restored to the Catholic Church all property taken by Protestant princes. Many people feared Ferdinand's growth in power, and they forced him to drop Wallenstein, so unhappy ending there for him. Enter Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. A military genius, he brought a disciplined and well-equipped army to northern Germany. By the way, he was also a devout Lutheran who wanted to help out his compatriots in Germany. The Swedish army swept through northern Germany. Wallenstein was returned to command, and he met Adolphus's army in Leipzig. At the Battle of Lutzen, the Swedish army won, but at the price of their king's life. After this, the Swedes proved to be less effective, and they were eventually pushed out of Germany by the imperial army. Ferdinand eventually attempts to annul the Edict of Restitution, which leads into the fourth and final phase of the war. France enters the war and proceeds to throw out any religious alliances. They were Catholics who were supporting the Protestant Swedes. Historically, this has never happened before. At the Battle of Rocroi, the French won a decisive victory against the Spanish, and they later went on to beat the Bavarian armies in southern Germany. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 officially ended the 30 Years' War.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware.
The Peace of Westphalia ensured that all German states could choose their own state religion. In addition, the 300 Holy Roman Empire states were recognized as virtually independent, and the Habsburg Emperor was reduced to a figurehead. Most importantly, religion was pushed to the backdrop as politics took place of public affairs.
After the 30 Years' War, France gained a new leadership under Louis XIII. But when Louis XIII gained the crown, he was very young, so Cardinal Richelieu was in charge for the time being, and he really wanted the centralized government of France, and he used these things called intendants to be able to administrate his new laws and policies, because France at the time was into different states under nobles, and he really wanted to unify it. And he created this new tally, a new tax that would even centralize the government more. What's important is when he died, and Louis XIII died too, Louis XIV came to power, and he was also very young, so a student of Cardinal under Louis XIII, Richelieu, was replaced by Mazarin. And Mazarin was Italian. He wasn't really liked by the nobles of France for not being French. Now, and that's what was started a rebellion. The first Fondé and then the second Fondé. The first Fondé was a group of nobles in the Parliament of Paris that rebelled against Mazarin's tax policies and laws, and they were met with agreement. But the second Fondé was a group of rebels from the nobles of sword that wanted to gain power for their own personal desires. Cardinal Mazarin died, and Louis XIV was of age to take the throne. Now, when Louis XIV became King of France, he was very dedicated, and he really wanted to create a monarchy that France would remember, and that's why they call him the Sun God. So he created this palace called the Versailles Palace, which brought all the nobles in France together, and he had them all under control, so he would be able to take care of their politics and just let the nobles just sit around and do nothing in a building. And once that was done, he really did hate Protestants because he only wanted one religion in France. So he made the Edict of Fontainebleau, which basically replaced the Edict of Nantes at the religious wars back in the 1500s, and brought about the removal of over 200,000 Protestants to America, England, and German states. Louis XIV had made 4 major wars. The first one was with some states, France, Comté, and the Netherlands. His second war with the Dutch, because the Dutch formed the Triple Alliance against France, and he successfully destroyed the Dutch. Third war, which was the League of Augsburg, that formed once the Dutch were destroyed against France, and France went through a bloody famine and bloody war to just gain a little bit in Strasbourg and Lawrence. And then the War of Spanish Succession was the most important, the Fourth War, which made France more allied with Spain, because Spain, Philip V was the Bourbon family, which that's where the Louis XIV was from. And when Philip V came along, it was a hope of recovery, and it led to another war because of an imbalance of power in Europe. After the War of Spanish Succession, the Treaty of Berwick was signed, which told Philip V of Spain that he was no longer allowed to deal with the kingdoms of the Bourbon family of France. And when that was signed, Spain had lost the war, so they lost all their Italian and European provinces to Austria, which made Austria have more power in Europe at the time. And at that time, the Holy Roman Empire was becoming less and less in states after the 30 Years' War. And basically, the Holy Roman Empire had turned into Austria-Hungary and all the 300 German states in the middle, and then Brandenburg, Prussia. Now, what was important is Brandenburg, Prussia was 3 big masses of land, all split apart by German states and Poland. Now, and it was really unified by William the Great Elector, made the Junkers, which were the nobility of Prussia, more powerful, and was able to create a new bureaucracy and able to gain more land and create a larger army for Prussia, making them a world power equal to France and England. Now, Ottoman Empire was a group of Muslims that were expanding in southern Europe, and they eventually conquered Greece, and they eventually conquered Bulgaria, Albania, and all of the Macedonia and all that. And then, so they started fighting at Transylvania, and the Ottomans actually got so far up in the Europe that they actually sieged Vienna, but they lost that battle. And then a peace treaty was signed, which gave Austria the rights to Croatia, Transylvania, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire was not able to expand further into Europe. Austria was then a unified empire from Italy to Eastern Europe, but Poland was always a struggle. Poland was allies with Sweden, but both Sweden and Poland had governments that weren't all that capable of solving the issues that were at hand in Eastern Europe. And Poland was basically a unified state that was ran by different nobles of each parts of the country and had a king that wasn't really in charge of anything. In Eastern Europe, Russia was very slow behind on westernization. And the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, started up the reign of the Caesars, known as Tsars in Russia. And what they did was they set up the same type of government that France did, royalty, but they had not westernized. They didn't have a palace to represent them. They didn't have any prestige or any of that, and they didn't have a big army either. And that's why they would lose the beginning of the war with Sweden pretty badly. And so after a few czars, this one czar named Peter the Great comes along, and he wants to westernize Russia. He called this state the backwards country. And what he did was he took a trip to England and different parts of Europe, and he brought that back to Russia. And he lessened serfdom, and he created the capital. He moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and he was credited with creating the first Russian navy. And once he had defeated Sweden, he made them, he humiliated them in defeat, and he expanded Russia from the Ural Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And after that, he had accomplished what no other Russian leader had accomplished before him. After the death of Queen Elizabeth started a new dynasty in Europe called the Stuart Dynasty, which was seen by the election of James I as the new King of England. And what James I had a problem with is the type of parliament setup that England had during the time of Elizabeth I and Henry VIII. And that parliament was the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And the House of Commons was mainly Puritan dominated, and the House of Lords was mainly Catholic and rich people dominated, which was the line that James came from. Now, the people didn't really like James because he didn't really talk to the House of Commons much. He just basically ignored them after a certain period. But then Charles I came to reign, and they passed the Petition of Right, which made him, before he was to give out taxes, they had to be approved by the House of Commons before that would happen. So when Charles I saw this, he just ignored it, and they called that tyrannical, and they eventually kicked him out and executed him. And that was done by Cromwell and his regime that rebelled against the English government at the time. And once they had succeeded, they abolished the House of Lords, and they just made England a republic under the House of Commons. After that, he was replaced by Charles II, and nobody really liked that because they saw another Catholic coming up to reign. So after that happened, Charles II did the Test Act, which basically made only certain people in Parliament able to be Catholic, and that got everyone mad. And then James II came along, his son, and he did the Declaration of Indulgences, which made everyone in the government have to be Catholic. And that just infuriated all the Puritans and everyone, so they sent in William III of Orange and Mary II to take over the government. And they eventually kicked out James II, and that's what's called the Glorious Revolution. Two major philosophers, John Locke and Hobbes, came out of hiding, and they were able to discuss the world government in their daily lives. And John Locke had his famous 2 treatises of government, and Hobbes had his Leviathan.
After the Renaissance, European art underwent a series of stylistic changes, the first of all being Mannerism, which emerged from Italy between the 1520s and 1530s. Now, Mannerism is characterized by a lot of suffering and intense emotion.
Lidandet. Suffering. Ett evigt lidande.
So much suffering.
Den typen av lidande som aldrig tar slut. Suffering.
Suffering.
En jävla massa lidande.
The most important artist of the Mannerism period was a man named El Greco, whose unusual use of yellow and greenish hues led to a series of emotions that evoke suffering. The next art style that followed after the Mannerism period was the Baroque period, which was characterized by a lot of the same sort of intense emotions. It originated in Italy and spread throughout the rest of Europe. Now, the most famous Baroque artist was a man named Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Now, Dutch realism focused on realistic portrayal of everyday life, as is portrayed in the works of Judith Leyster, the first woman to be accepted into the Guild of St. Luke in Haarlem. It was around this time that theater began emerging as a new form of entertainment, and at its forefront was William Shakespeare. Now, William Shakespeare is universally regarded as a master of the theater, and he is also considered a universal genius. During his lifetime, he wrote over 157 sonnets and 37 plays.
Hey, that's the end of this video, but don't forget to check out the other lessons that may or may not be linked in the description below.